Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, especially on a Friday. Today, the State Department released the 2017 country reports on human rights practices. Promoting freedom, promoting and defending human rights and fundamental freedoms are central to who we are as a country, and the United States will continue to support those around the world struggling for human dignity and liberty. This is the 42nd annual Human Rights Report that the Department has now released. We're delighted to have our Acting Secretary of State, John Sullivan, with us here today to say a few words about this report. After Acting Secretary Sullivan's remarks, we will invite Ambassador Michael Kozak to the podium to answer some of your questions. I will help facilitate, as we all know one another, and assist with that. Ambassador Kozak is a senior bureau official with the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and he's looking forward to speaking with you shortly. He has served this department under Republican and Democrat administrations for 46 years, which is incredible. Sir, thank you for your service to the State Department. And with that, I will hand it over to the podium to our Acting Secretary, John Sullivan. Sir.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here to formally release the 2017 country reports on human rights practices. Now in their 42nd year, these reports are a natural outgrowth of our values as Americans. The founding documents of our country speak to unalienable rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. Revolutionary concepts at the time of our founding that are now woven into the fabric of America and its interests, both at home and abroad. Promoting human rights and the idea that every person has inherent dignity is a core element of this administration's foreign policy. It also strengthens U.S. national security by fostering greater peace, stability, and prosperity around the world. The human rights reports are the most comprehensive and factual accounting of the global state of human rights. They help our government and others formulate policies and encourage both friends and foes to respect the dignity of all individuals without discrimination. This year, we've sharpened the focus of the report to be more responsive to statutory reporting requirements and more focused on government action or inaction with regard to the promotion and protection of human rights. For example, each executive summary includes a paragraph to note the most egregious abuses that occurred in a particular country, including those against women, LGBTI persons, persons with disabilities, indigenous persons, and members of religious minorities. Before I turn the podium over to Mike, I'd like to discuss a few countries in particular, including some with the most egregious human rights records. The entire world is aware of the horrendous human rights abuses in Syria, including barrel bombing of civilians, attacks on hospitals, widespread reports of rape and abuse by Syrian government personnel. A week ago, the President took action, together with our French and British allies, to deter the use of chemical weapons and protect the human rights of Syrian civilians. We condemn the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya in Burma and the atrocities committed against them, and we are working with partners to address that crisis. More than 670,000 Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh in recent months. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been internally displaced. Those responsible for the violations, abuses, and attacks must be held accountable. The DPRK is one of the most repressive and abusive regimes in the world. As the report makes clear, the Kim regime systematically neglects the well-being of its people to underwrite and fund its illicit weapons programs via forced labor, child labor, and the export of North Korean workers. China continues to spread the worst features of its authoritarian system, including restrictions on activists, civil society, freedom of expression, and the use of arbitrary surveillance. The absence of an independent judiciary, the government's crackdown on independent lawyers, and tight controls on information undermine the rule of law. We're particularly concerned about the efforts of Chinese authorities to eliminate the religious, linguistic, and cultural identities of Uyghur Muslims and Tibetan Buddhists, as well as restrictions on the worship of Christians. The Iranian people continue to suffer at the hands of their leaders. The right of peaceful assembly and freedoms of association and expression are the legitimate expectation of all individuals worldwide. Unfortunately, for the Iranian people, these human rights are under attack almost daily. In Turkey, the detention of tens of thousands of individuals, including journalists and academics, under an ongoing state of emergency has undermined the rule of law there. In Venezuela, the Maduro regime represses the human rights of its people and denies them the right to have a voice in their government. Thousands flee their homes daily in response to this growing humanitarian crisis. At the Summit of the Americas last week, Vice President Pence announced $16 million in humanitarian aid from the United States to help those who have fled Venezuela and are in desperate need of food, water, and medical help. We stand by the Venezuelan people, even as their leaders refuse to allow aid into the country. Finally, the Russian government continues to quash dissent in civil society, even while it invades its neighbors and undermines the sovereignty of Western nations. We, once again, urge Russia to end its brutal occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, to halt the abuses perpetrated by Russian-led forces in Ukraine's Donbass region, and to address impunity for the human rights violations and abuses in the Republic of Chechnya. That's a brief overview of the factual reports on countries of most concern. I know that Ambassador Kozak will be happy to answer any questions you may have, but before I turn the podium over to him, let me note at least a few bright spots. Uzbekistan. Although there's still much progress to be made, the country has pursued a strategic reform agenda with positive effects on human rights, including the release of 8 high-profile prisoners last year. In Liberia, the recent presidential election represents a milestone, marking the first peaceful transition from one democratically elected leader to another in more than 70 years. And in Mexico, the general law on forced disappearances established criminal penalties for persons convicted of forced disappearance and a national framework to find victims. These represent a few of the more positive examples noted in the reports which are released today. We hope to see many more positive accounts of countries taking serious action to improve the human rights record in the reports next year. In conclusion, let me say America leads the way globally to promote human rights. We will also continue to impose consequences on those who abuse human rights. Over the past year, through the Russia Magnitsky and Global Magnitsky sanctions programs, we have undertaken some of our most aggressive measures yet. No human rights abuser, no matter where in the world, is out of our reach. The human rights reports are a significant part of that overall effort. Creating them is an enormous undertaking and not for the faint-hearted. I'm grateful to so many of my colleagues in the State Department, including those here in Washington and many others in embassies and consulates around the world, who've made these reports possible and contribute to America's longstanding leadership in promoting human rights. So with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Acting Undersecretary Nauert and to my friend and colleague, Ambassador Mike Kozak. Thank you.
Ambassador Kozak will take some of your questions, and I'll kick off those questions. So thank you very much. One second. Sir, come on up. Thank you. Let's start our first question with the Associated Press's Matt Lee.
Thank you. I realize that this report doesn't cover the United States, but in this preface and in his comments just now, Acting Secretary Sullivan talked about how the U.S. is promotes and defends its rights, and that's central to us as a country, and that the United States will lead other nations by example in promoting rule of law and respect for human rights. And I'm just wondering how effective you think that you can be in leading by example when you accuse a lot of countries of, say, assaults on press freedom, when here in this country we have a president who routinely excoriates the press, calling individual media outlets and individual reporters sometimes fake news. I'm wondering how you can criticize countries for discrimination against LGBT people when this administration's stated policy is to exclude transgender people from serving in the military. I'm wondering about discrimination, about criticism of other countries for discriminating against religious minorities when courts and a lot of critics see the travel ban as, in fact, a ban on one particular religion. And lastly, you criticize countries for the mistreatment and refoulement of refugees, which I suppose this administration is not in that great of a position to do because it doesn't accept hardly any refugees, or at least far fewer than it ever did before. So how is this not, how are you do not open yourself up to charges of hypocrisy, and how effective do you think you can be at leading by example? Thank you.
Okay, let's see if I can remember each one of those. But I think as you go through the reports, you'll see the countries that we criticize for limiting press freedom. It's for things like having criminal libel laws where you can be put in jail for what you say. It's for things like yanking the licenses of media outlets you don't like, or in many cases, killing the journalists. So I think we make quite a distinction between political leaders being able to speak out and say that story was not accurate, or using even stronger words sometimes, and using state power to prevent the journalists from continuing to do their work. So I think there's an example there, and we've used that with many of our colleagues. The other end of your stream was refoulement, which is a legal term. It's sending somebody back to a place where you know they're going to be persecuted, or where they have a well-founded fear of persecution, without going through due process to assess the risk to them. And of course, our law provides that people have rights of appeal through the immigration court system and into the federal courts if they think they're going to be. So it doesn't go to the quantity of refugees. It goes to whether you're.
You're not in a position, if you even wanted to refool a refugee, you don't have many to do it to. But it's also mistreatment of refugees. It's not just that. So.
Yeah, and that usually involves, as you'll find documented in many countries in the report, physical mistreatment of refugees and that kind of thing. You're LGBT. As we are very clear in the reports, and this has been U.S. policy for some time, the things we're focused on are, is the government in question criminalized same-sex sexual activity, and that's highlighted now right up front in the reports. Have they failed to prevent violence against people because of their LGBT status? Or the same applies to ethnic groups and religious and so on. And then third, discrimination in housing, employment, and government services. Usually military and police are, a slightly different form of government employment. So you can have a debate about that one, but most of the other countries where we're criticizing them, I think we would be very happy if they were following procedures we are. There are a lot of policy decisions in these areas that governments make that aren't internationally recognized human rights. So that's where we try to distinguish, and that's nothing new. That's been the case in the last couple of administrations as well.
Thank you.
Michelle from CNN.
Yeah.
I'd like to know if you think that such statements in the United States weaken the impact of this report, because the American president has called the press an enemy of the people. And I think at one point he called for a closer look at libel laws or something like that. Do you think in the eyes of people that are looking at this report as an example and as a resource, do statements like that currently weaken its impact?
Well, I think the report is very clear about the kinds of things that we consider to be inappropriate restrictions on freedom of the media. As I mentioned, the using the legal system to go after members of the press, using physical force and so on, it doesn't go to the nature of discourse in a country. And you can have your own judgments as to how strong a statement might or might not be, but I don't think we have a hard time explaining that in a lot of places. When you talk to some of my friends in Cuba, for example, who try to be independent journalists there and are routinely slapped around. They also get called names, but I think if it were limited to that, they'd be pretty happy as compared to the situation they're in now. So.
And when the State Department is talking about, this represents our values as Americans, the removal of sections on women's reproductive rights, why is that not included in values as Americans?
There's still a long section on women, and by the way, if you look elsewhere in the report, I mean, women are also activists, are also journalists. It was. I'm going to explain why it was removed. It was introduced 6 years ago into the report. It hadn't been there before. It's one of the few terms that are used in the report that isn't derived from an international treaty that has a definition, or derived from U.S. law, where there's a clear definition to the term. And in this case, the previous administration intended it to mean look at the availability of contraception, at the whether the government tried to impose or coerce people in making decisions about reproduction. In the statements that were made, this was derived from the Beijing Declaration that was done in the 90s. At that time, it was very clear, and our delegation made a very clear statement that this has nothing to do with abortion. It doesn't mean abortion. It doesn't mean abortion. Unfortunately, over the last few years, groups on both sides of that issue domestically have started to use the term, and both seem to think it does include abortion and then argue about it. So our thought was, let's just not use a term that has the opposite meaning from the one we intend. We went back to the term that's used in the U.S. statute that requires the Human Rights Report, which is coerced family planning, namely coerced abortion or involuntary sterilization. I might mention, too, because I went back and looked at last year's report, the question being asked was, what were there obstacles opposed to getting contraception information and means? The answer in virtually every country was no. There were no obstacles, other than in almost every country, including our own, the availability in rural areas is less than it is in urban areas. But we were taking a lot of space to explain that. So what we've done, we've kept that information in there. We've done it now by a hyperlink. We used to take that information from the WHO report and put it in. We said, let's just use a hyperlink, and then there's actually more information available that way. So that's the rationale behind that. It's not a diminishment of women's rights or desire to get away from it. It was to stop using a term that has several different meanings that are not all the ones we intend.
Dave Budd from AFP.
Hi, thank you very much. When countries around the world are looking at the U.S. for leadership on human rights, should they be looking at this report, or should they be looking at President Trump's embrace of Rodrigo Duterte, of meeting with Sisi, and with the very warm relations with Mohammed bin Salman, who runs a country where women have no rights at all? What sends the strongest signal? The President's close personal friendship with Xi Jinping and his golf tours in Mar-a-Lago, or you at that podium decrying human rights abuses?
Well, this is an official report, and by the way, I think it's one of the most widely read U.S. government documents in the world when we do the hit counts on the internet. It's put out in the name of the Secretary of State, who was just here to deliver it, and he certainly is reflecting the President in this. I think this is showing what we assessed to be the human rights situation in all of the countries you just mentioned, including now even more so the responsibility of the government for the abuses that are occurring there. We're not just saying there are these societal problems in the country. We're saying the government either has done these bad deeds or not. And I'll give you some examples. In Russia, we highlighted the fact their response to an increase in domestic violence there, and they have a terrible problem. I mean, tens of thousands of deaths of women being killed in domestic disputes every year. But since it went up, the government spokesman who went into the State Duma said, well, we have to decriminalize this because it's better that our women be beaten than that our men be humiliated by their behavior. So, and this was Putin's party. They decriminalized spousal beating. So not a very good thing. Now, does that mean that the president should never speak to these people? This is what we're trying to keep the report as the factual baseline for what we're going to do in policy terms or sanctions, as the secretary was mentioning. So we can learn a lot from this, and we can use it to formulate a policy. But usually part of your policy is engaging with the people whose behavior you're trying to change at some level. And I don't think those two things are in distinction. The fact is, these other governments and their populations do read the report, and I don't think they discount it because the president speaks with their leader or otherwise. And when the president speaks with their leader, often he's talking about these issues. So it's complementary. It's not two things that are in conflict.
Some examples. What does Saudi law say about spousal abuse?
Saudi law is very, very restrictive on women. We've tried to encourage changes in that. We've seen the minor changes that are reflected in the report, that they've started to, say they're going to allow women to drive cars and so on. That isn't very much, but it is a baby step in the right direction, and we're trying to encourage more of that kind of reform at the same time that we're calling out the areas in which they're deficient, which are many.
Rich Hudson from Fox News.
Thanks, Heather. Ambassador, I want to follow up a little bit on Saudi Arabia, the conversation you're just having with Dave. You note in the report, and a lot has happened on the government level in Saudi Arabia in just the past year, and you note in the report the jailing or hoteling of 200 officials there.
Hoteling, that's a good thing.
Are you overall in Saudi Arabia, are you encouraged by some of the things that are happening? Are you discouraged by what's happened over the past year? Where do you see the trend going in Saudi Arabia?
Well, of course, it's always hard to predict trends, but I think I'm always encouraged when you start to see things break out of a static holding pattern. When you see a little bit of change, as we're seeing in Saudi Arabia, and the hoteling was connected to, ostensibly anyway, to more of concern about corruption, which is not another one of our issues, insofar as corruption and human rights abuse tend to go together. So we're trying to encourage that kind of movement on the part of the Saudis. At the same time, you can look at that and say, well, you didn't do this with sufficient due process, and I think that's also well spelled out here. So it's trying to get that right balance of, hey, here's where we think you're deficient, but we're seeing some movement, and we're trying to encourage the movement in the positive direction and see more. But I'm usually more encouraged when I see some movement going on than when things are just stuck in the same rut for years and years and years. So in that sense, at least there's an opportunity there. We'll see if it comes to anything.
So is hoteling now going to be standard language?
I think your colleague just came up with a new term.
Cindy with Voice of America. We have a few minutes left.
Yes, thank you. We were talking about press freedoms, and you're probably aware that in Nicaragua, the Ortega government ordered at least 5 television stations off the air for their coverage of massive protests.
Yep.
What is the U.S. government prepared to do to stem this new wave of repression?
Well, Nicaragua is, and I think if you looked at the report, is going the wrong direction on many fronts, and that is one of them, of media freedom, but also on all the basics. I mean, it's a long litany of, torture, extrajudicial killing, the elections were a sham. And so we've put more and more pressure on. I think you will see some of the sanctions programs will start to affect some people in that country. But it's a tough one. The Ortega government has basically shut down a lot of the opposition, a lot of the independent civil society organizations, as well as the free media. So, I mean, and our policy everywhere, and certainly in Nicaragua, is to try to provide both moral and, to the extent we can, support NGOs and so on that are working to help them keep working, help free media keep working, and bring about a change in that dimension. But it's tough. But we can't do it ourselves. We have to be in a position of supporting the people in those countries that are trying to bring about change, and we try to do that through a variety of means. The Secretary, not sure he met with any Nicaraguans, but at the Summit of the Americas had meetings with civil society activists from Cuba, Venezuela, same camp as Nicaragua. And it was part just to give them that, show that we stand with them and that we're trying to be supportive of what they're trying to do to bring about change in their own country.
Janny, excuse me, Janny, go right ahead.
On North Korean human rights issues, as the North Korean nuclear issue is an important issue and the North Korean human rights is also serious issues, unless the regime of North Korean Kim Jong-un changes the North Korean human rights abuse against the North Korean people will continue. What is the U.S. solutions on this?
Okay, we are concerned about the nuclear issue in North Korea, but we're equally concerned about the human rights issue, and they both derive from the same problem. And I think you see in the report we've laid out pretty starkly the kinds of abuses. And over the last year or two, we've supported like a commission of inquiry on North Korea. We support NGOs that are working on North Korea and exposing the human rights abuses that occur in the camps there and so on. But some of the stories that are contained in the report are just overwhelming. There's one about 11 people who were arrested for supposedly making a pornographic film, and they were executed by shooting anti-artillery weapons at them, and then they brought out tanks and ran over the bodies. And, you know, this is supposed to be a civilized country. So, you know, I don't think you will see a diminishment in our concern about that issue, even as we try to work the nuclear issue. It's not a trade-off. I think the president's laid out a vision there that North Korea can get on a much better path, but it needs to make progress across the board, not just on one issue.
So the report considers China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea forces of instability. What do you mean by that? And will there be any consequences?
Well, I don't know that we've called them as forces of instability in the report, perhaps.
Yeah,
in the preface. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, I think that has to do with their international behavior as well as their internal behavior. I mean, sometimes internal behavior, you can't really separate them, because when you start oppressing your own people, you generate refugee flows, you generate humanitarian crises like you're seeing in Venezuela, for example. So, but there's not, saying something is a force of instability is saying or characterizing a set of facts. It doesn't necessarily have a prescribed policy flow. None of this does. This report doesn't say countries that reach a certain level, we're going to cut off aid or something like that. It's the factual predicate for making those decisions, but those are policy decisions where the president and his advisors will have to weigh a whole number of factors.
And our final question, Kylie from CBS News.
Can I just go back to the reproductive rights for a second? So you said there are no obstacles for women to get contraception in any country, except for if there's a remote issue, right?
I said with some exceptions, and the exceptions were and still are, and we've really gotten at it by flipping it back to the original U.S. statutory language. It's in places like China, where in order to enforce their two-child policy, that there are reports of coerced abortion and involuntary sterilization. In North Korea, where the government also coerces or forces abortion, although sometimes that's for political punishment rather than family planning. And we uncovered, as we were digging through trying to reduce the bulk of some of this report, I found in the old country I served in Belarus, that it turns out that the doctors in the state hospitals, and particularly in the institutions there, if they have a woman who is pregnant and who is a woman with disabilities, the doctors insist on an abortion. Or if they believe the fetus has a disability, they'll insist on an abortion. So we've called that out too. So it's not Those were the cases, though, in the under the previous formula where you would say there was a restriction on family planning, freedom of family planning. For most countries, it said there isn't any restriction except for the ones imposed by economics and rural urban type things. So
just to be clear, just on
Yeah.
that, so taking out the language about those cases, therefore means that the U.S. doesn't believe that the inability for women to get an abortion physically or by law is an abuse of human rights.
that's correct under the previous administration and this one and the one before that. We have never taken the position that abortion was a right under a human right under international law. This is supposed to be internationally recognized human rights. And it's an issue on which, you know, some countries prohibit abortion, some countries like our own have pretty much no restriction on it. And we don't say one of those is right, one of those is wrong. We don't report on it because it's not a human right. It's an issue of great policy debate. You can have a good discussion, but there's no internationally recognized standard as to what's the right treatment. But the other, yes, it is internationally recognized that somebody shouldn't coerce you to have an abortion or force you to be sterilized. So that's.
Thank you, sir. The ambassador has to go. Thank you so much. We have to go. Sir, thank you. Thank you. We'll get you another time. Sir, thank you.